So, innovating in fashion. It's a bit athletic, isn't it? No doubt. This afternoon, we'll be looking at social influence as well. I don't know why they've talked about positive social impact, because no doubt you'd imagine it's supposed to be positive and not negative.
Did you understand what I said? Absolutely. So thank you so much to be here, Gemma. We say Gemma or Gemma? Gemma, excuse me. Thank you so much to be here, Gemma. Your company's 19 amendment. Yeah. Very interesting. The title and the name is quite interesting. Close to you, Monsieur Godard. Monsieur Godard. Et HEC. HEC is the school? L'école? Oh, vous êtes étudiant?
Are you a student there? What year student are you? Ah, well, I'm a teacher. Ah, teacher, lovely. Okay. Thomas, take your seat. I see you have your coffee. Although you've been at the coffee shop, that's lovely. Also have other people. Right, so that's lovely. We're going to be talking about this obviously positive social impact. It's a bit of a tautology, isn't it, to talk about a positive social impact, because you imagine it's positive. Gemma will be speaking in English. You can use your interpretation headset. Frederick Goddard, he's coming from HEC. Mr. Boulanger, About a Worker, that's your company. It's expanding apace. It's Kim Hu and Paul, you live and work together, no doubt. Camille Le Gall, who'd love to work and live with you, quite obviously. And Thomas, who's keeping a watchful eye over everything that's happening. So Camille, let's turn to you. You can set the ball rolling. Everybody will be able to succinctly present or introduce their company and what they do in that company, what their focus, their research focus is. And we've got an hour ahead of us to get into the heart of the matter. There's a numerous audience around us, and they can also get involved. Camille, thanks very much, Gilles. My name is Camille Le Gall, co-creator of Fairly Made. This is a co-responsible sourcing company. We provide support to brands to have committed collections. What does that mean then? Well, it's factories. We represent that the manufacturing side of things in terms of dyeing, manufacturing, and what have you, manufacturing, to make sure basically that the clothes arrive in the high street with this commitment. Great. Now, you said you knew Camille, but you don't do exactly the same. Serge was in a round table earlier on, and we saw there that people might or not, or might know each other or not. Thomas, what do you do? Slow we are. There's lots of people who work there, isn't there? Yes, with Eloise, I'm a co-founder. Eloise will be joining us in just a moment. She's on her way. So, yes, for us. So what do you do, actually? What's your job? Well, we're an information platform on co-responsible fashion. And we also provide advice to consumers. That's interesting. That's important, in fact, because the round table, when we talk about biosourcing, yesterday we talked about behavior in that realm. Maybe the HEC professor will tell us his thoughts. But the lack of information. Sometimes information can be too much and not understood. Well, maybe it's not sourced properly. Well, that's also possible. So we work, if you will, like journalists, professionally. We try to glean a huge amount of data, and we seek experts to provide information that can be accessible and verifiable for the benefit of the consumer. So we have Gemma Sol.
19th Amendment.
So 19th Amendment is a marketplace for on-demand pre-sales. We actually have a separate half of the company which is enabled, which is just over there. So
which is that?
It's just the booth right in the corner over there. So enabled is the core of the business. It's basically a production software for on-demand quick-term production and inventory-free retailing.
Thank you so much for your merci pour votre présentation et introduction. Alors les About.
Okay, Kim Hu, About a Worker, and we have Paul Boulanger. So, let's start with Kim, ladies first, possibly. What do you do? Well, about a worker. Yes, it's reflected in what we wear. Overall, work overalls. We're kind of a movement, if you will, to have plants or factories linked up to fashion and consumers through designs. So we want people to be able to make their own collection and become fashion designers. So staff, therefore, is sort of ephemeral, isn't it? You help people make their own clothes, is that right? Well, yes and no. I mean, we provide input with certain staff, but we focus mainly on what textile factories are doing. For us, as shop floor workers, these are the craftsmen of the 21st century. Thanks to design, therefore, we give them an avenue to explore and enable them to get across their ideas and their personal histories, if you like, through their savoir-faire. An example? Well, we did a first workshop in Saint-Denis for workers after a 4-stage initiation, a creative process, which is tailored to each individual context. Each of these workers was able to create a podium statement which reflected and mirrored his vision of the industry and his role in the industry. And with these overalls that are built and put together, then that creates, therefore, an image, and then a range is put together. And it's fleshed out. Great, we'll look at that in a bit later on. So, Mr. Professor, Mr. Frederick Escher, of course, we all know what that is. It's a high-flying business school. That's right, you're a professor. So, since you're a professor, could you please define what social impact we're dealing with here? Well, perhaps I could introduce myself first. Well, yes, go ahead, that's fine. So, we address fashion issues, and I've seen significant changes underway. It's not over and done, by the way. The proof is the fact that we're talking about this, and I study animal well-being as well, furs, what our militants are doing, and to think about how their rhetoric can be impactful to stop fur usage. And what about the fur of animals that we eat? That's a good question. Perhaps I'll look at that in a moment. But you did talk about mindfulness and sensitizing people, the role of a teacher in that vein, to make sure that students are mindful of their societal responsibilities. We work with partners in the field and in the business. It's important for a business school. We try and improve things as best we can from our field. So, a comment you might wish to make is that increasingly business schools or engineering schools want teachers to teach about materials. Even basically students are asked to understand what materials are per se. Yes, but that goes beyond materials proper, but also working conditions. That's very important. That's true. We're going to be handing over to Slovia in just a moment, but unless I'm mistaken, of course, HEC, here we have 19th Amendment, we have fairly made about a worker. Of course, HEC is well versed in English, but these are all international words, aren't they? Well, let me just pick up on what Frederick was saying, to say that we also sensitize and use outreach. And this also involves business schools, design schools, and fashion schools. Fashion schools is something that is starting to turn up, but two years down the road, if you will. Can you tell us more about that? Well, it means there's a demand from schools, that's right, on luxury syllabuses, people who are not involved in manufacturing textiles per se. Oh, you're talking about fashion designers, people who are doing the designing. So it's management schools, or it starts with engineering schools and management schools before, at the end of the day, getting into the heart of innovation, the factual designing proper. So what about the teaching about the materials? Is that something that has been addressed, as has been said on my right? Well, I think currently there is a sort of a deficit in fashion schools to address that point, and we turn up with looking at fairly made materials to show what a material is. And when you're talking about tencel, when you're talking about organic cotton, what are we dealing with? What's the look and feel? And this is something that has only been around for the last 12 months, really, if that. You think it's recent as well, the interest expressed in materials in terms of what the syllabus is, the content of the syllabus is?
I haven't seen that much on the materials side. What I've seen talking to schools in the States, like FIT, Parsons, is most of the time it's more just general production management skills haven't been taught. Like, they don't have access to PLMs on the basic level. They don't get trained on any of the sort of core technology of going into production at a larger scale. So that's what I see the most of versus the materials. Usually most ambitious students will go out and find the materials themselves. They'll go on Instagram, they'll follow the news, the updates, but it's really the business side of the production that they don't get access to.
Thank you. Comment vous définissez l'impact social?
How do you define the social impact? This was the question I asked before, but you didn't answer this. Well, there was lots of debate on this, as always. Okay, well, we've understood the word impact, but so this positive social impact, okay, we all know what innovation means, so we're talking about advanced technology here as well. I would say that social impact, there's several things to that. This is what's interesting. That's what we need to look at. But it's quite broad as a subject. There's also the socioeconomic aspects, institutional aspects, legal aspects, regulatory aspects. Those are also very important in the field of fashion because public players want to do something. And then we've got technology as well. But technology is being pushed by social actors, companies that are financing this, that are funding it, that are promoting technology. So I would say that that is what social impact is, a positive impact, but it covers a wide spectrum, 4 or 5 different actors. Well, it seems like something very complicated. We can have a wonderful policy in terms of handling waste and retrieving old materials, but if the product is produced a long way away from the consumer, then there is an environmental impact. But the positive impacts of production, well, it's important to distinguish between that, and so there are some elements which are perhaps a priority without talking about the cost as well, and perhaps we can go into that a bit later on. Well, yes, in terms of the value chain, this is badly understood in terms of fashion, all the different elements that go into making an item. I've worked in industry for 20 years, and so I sometimes still discover things. It's one of the very complex chains. It's absolutely huge, and it's there are lots of different strata and layers. So imagine explaining this to students in a couple of hours, and then there are calculations that can be made on, and sometimes we have to make decisions, and they're not often easy to make. So we have to think about the whole thing and have a wider vision of this. So in your company, how do you interpret, because you do analysis as I understand it, how do you define these criteria which, when they're combined with other things, lead to this positive impact? Well, this is the issue. There are so many different ways of producing fashion and producing garments, so sometimes we were overwhelmed with how slow we are. When we started, how can we compare somebody producing something in Cambodia, China, with somebody who's producing a garment in France? Because the materials are not necessarily available here, or in a recycled version anyway. Or how can we attach a label to somebody who works completely differently, producing shoes, garments, or accessories? And what we felt was important was to find a kind of consistency Thank you. A vision, a kind of holistic vision of things, a broad vision of things. So we carry out an audit in 4 steps, corporate social responsibility, the value chain commitments, amongst others. And so it's that global consistency which allows us to define if a label is eco-responsible or not. In terms of eco-responsibility, there are lots of different things. But then it's up to the consumer to make the choice to see if he wants to look at the made in France aspect, if they want to go for organic natural fibers or something else. Okay, but I think that this approach is very good, and the objective as well. Well, of course, we don't claim to know everything, but we do collect a lot of data on these items, and so this consistency that I mentioned is a consistency of committed people. We want to work with people who change the field of fashion. Very recently, there was a brand that we started working with that had everything right in terms of sourcing and the way that they produced garments. But we didn't think that this was enough. From year to year, we are around to help brands to develop, to accompany them, but we want them to interact between brands, label brands, and we want them to find out more. So there's this kind of awareness raising that we have to do with the consumer. As a media, we can't do this on our own. As a label, we can't do this on our own. We have to all work together. Okay, so this is a very international vision of things. Okay, you're not based in France, so do you find that this kind of commitment that Thomas is referring to is the same in the US or in the Anglo-Saxon countries?
Rapporté à l'industrie de la mode.
I'm talking about the fashion industry.
So the U.S. market, it's always product first. I mean, you have a lot of great brands coming out, like Allbirds, I think is a good example of a brand in the States that's come up relatively recently, owns the entire supply chain and innovates off of that. But if they're, I don't own, this is not an endorsement for all brands, but I don't own their shoes. But if their product wasn't amazing, nobody would maybe care about the sheep in New Zealand that they raise. So, but for us, where we look to add the most value, because we work with a lot of small brands as well as bigger brands that are trying to test new products, they can't go that deep in the supply chain yet. So we try and provide transparency based on automatic real-time updates in production that allow the consumer to see who's making their clothes where and when and what's happening, which provides a logistical angle for the brand because they know exactly what's happening, but it also gives the customer an insight into the production process and what's going on, and reduces return rates because they've been taking along in that process. So there's sort of benefits that the consumer sees by having that increased touch point. That's not necessarily about sustainability, but more about the trust.
Intéressant cette notion de confiance.
So this idea of trust, that's a very interesting concept. I trust you. Well, I would say trust and also desirability, because I think that our colleague already highlighted that, Gemma. So, and the two co-founders, this was more for fast fashion. I used to buy for H&M. So it was that kind of fashion that we want to make eco-responsible, but it has to be first and foremost desirable. So we had to create our bibliothèque of materials and do lots of nice shots of all the different materials we want to develop with the brands. And this goes right up to accompany the brands in terms of developing their content and in the future. And I refer to our Instagram. So this is all very topical then. You can have a good business case with for a French brand that we accompanied, and they explain the whole of the value chain. So we regularly go to the factories. So how do you make these tops? So they start with a capsule, so a collection of about 15 different models. So we concentrated on organic cotton and natural dyeing. So yes, we've got Ecotex or GOTS labels, but we would try to use natural dyes. And this goes the same thing for organic cotton, tencel, or cellulose fibers. But the idea is always to take things back to the yarn. And this is the practices that we show those brands that we work with. Who does the yarn? Who produces the materials? Who makes the garment? Because this request for traceability, this is very important for the consumer. Okay, this leads me to another question. Up to what point in France, in Europe, we've got the whole gamut of the whole chain, haven't we? Well, that's the question. So we think about the different, look at things from a sector standpoint. So if we can't create added value for the sector, so we try to think in terms of the sector. So we have to build the sector, but that things are developing at different speeds. But France, we're dealing with recycled materials. India, organic cotton. It depends where you source the material from. For recycled cashmere, that will be in China. So it all depends on the material. So you have to be demanding. You have to respond to the consumer needs and expectations. But at the same time, you have to be realistic. So this is why I was referring to the sector. Some things are possible, some things are not. So we have to be agile as well in terms of your sourcing system, and you have to adapt to each market. Yes, of course. So we talked about desirability. What about the workers, people who work in a specific environment, the factory, or whatever? How do you work with these people? How do you contact them? Is it the store manager who's shop store manager who says, "Okay, well, I've heard about you." How do you go about that? What's the process? So we try to find workshops that we can work with in France or in Europe or in all over the world. In fact, sometimes we're contacted by brands, large brands, who want to work with their own employees. And you said, well, we've talked a lot about materials, sourcing materials, etc. But in terms of social impact, what we've forgotten is the place of the worker in the creative process and the value of those people. So we've got lots of indicators that say how much we pollute, where the material comes from, how it's composed, but nobody knows who has been making this garment, and this is what's most important for us. It's a very exciting subject. There are very few indicators on this. It's not very concrete at the moment, but we have labels, but they have certain limits to them as well. So this is what we're really working on at the moment. Fashion is one of the most hierarchical environments that exist. So you mean in terms of the way the sectors are organized? Well, both. So within a company itself, or even the relationship between the consumer, the worker, and the fashion elite. So they work together. So you're talking about adherence to the brand? No, because often these brands don't have their own workshops apart from the luxury brands. So we talked about designers before, and students as well, fashion students. A student will not know which workers are working for what brands and how the garment is created, even when they come out of school. And so there's a real lack of a link, creating a link between each of the different players in the fashion chain. And we need to reestablish that. Well, in other sectors, like the automobile industry, does that exist? So it's not about verticality then. Well, it's just as bad in that sector, but the real problem here is that we have procrastinated and put off lots and lots of questions for a long, long time. So this is why we have these huge environmental issues and ethical issues in fashion. Had we started a debate and had we looked at the problems that occur in a company, had we assessed all that, perhaps we would have come up with some solutions. But for a long time we preferred to hide our head in the sand and ignore all that. And the law on vigilance, on due diligence, there's a new law on that. So I'm part of Fashion Revolution France, and for 6 years now we have celebrated that particular anniversary. Things are changing, but very slowly. Now, in terms of implementing this vigilance plans, the law was ratified in 2017 and implemented in 2018. So 2019 is the first anniversary then of this law, and where we can draw the lessons from this particular law. And so this duty of vigilance law means that you have to set up vigilant plans for all French companies with more than 5,000 employees, and also international companies that have more than 10,000 employees worldwide, and they have an office in France. So they have to set up this vigilance plan for their suppliers. And we know that in fashion we can go up to various ranks. But when we've got 17 different ranks, 17 different entities, things get very complicated. And for the moment, we can just handle the last two.
But the National Parliament in April received a summary looking at the 80 audited companies, but none in the fashion sector had set up a vigilance plan, even though we know that this bill does affect French design companies, but hasn't got much teeth at the moment. Put it that way, this law. Perhaps I would add a point about the industry. Kim is absolutely right. There's lots of examples abound. Companies that seek to be flatter in their hierarchy, less oppressive environment, working environment, what have you, or where happiness is higher among workers. You can see that in cement, biscuit making, in tire manufacturing, in high tech. But in fashion, they're a bit thin on the ground. I mean, if you know them, I'm takers. So it's absolutely right what's been said. So this notion of vigilance, then, as the gentleman explained, the rules in America, are they similar? Responsibility of the entrepreneur?
We have fashion revolution in the US. As far as I know, there's some legal labeling laws, the sort of the standard stuff, but nothing quite as intense as France. Yeah, no, nothing I can imagine right now.
Pour compléter, juste encore aujourd'hui.
Just as an ancillary point, we talked about the environment initially. The only thing that's mandatory in France in terms of garments, it's what goes into the makeup, the inputs of the garment. The ADM is currently thinking with some of us about environmental labeling or icons or advertising. But is it because it's very difficult to lock down, to kind of decide what would feature there? I mean, you're experts, but it's difficult really to immediately understand, what input we're dealing with. Maybe it's not. I think it's probably true, the fact that people don't understand information because it's possibly too complex. Even the information that features on labels, on the actual garment themselves. Off you go. What do we think? Well, there's very little legibility. H&M announced a few months ago that on some of their garments they were going to feature the address of the plant where the garment was manufactured, but that's not enough. Well, why is that progress then, to know that? I mean, to know that it was put together in Vesoul, in the east of France. Well, not much of a textile presence there, but anyway, in Sorrento, let's say, or in Istanbul, or in Bangladesh. To what extent? I mean, why is it useful? I mean, it might be highly subjective. Maybe I'm going out on a limb, but why is that a valuable piece of information? Well, just imagine a textile chain in Morocco, and there are two lines. One are doing baby clothes, and the other one are doing luxury. At the end of the day, they're processing the same textiles. But if on the baby clothes you knew who was putting together the garments, I think the women in that production chain would feel that their job was valuable. And I think all brands have got something positive to gain from that. There's no taboo about No, no, obviously not, says the speaker. Everybody's work is worthy and dignified. Yes, but I think we shouldn't pull wool in front of people's eyes, that's all. I just think that it's a duty to be transparent. I think that is incumbent upon the brand. Yeah, made in Italy, made in France, what have you. They're made in a given country, per se. What about Portugal? Yes, Portugal as well, but that means a number of things. It could also mean employing Chinese workers, but you're having them sweat in an Italian garage. You know, recently I was in China, and I found myself in a shop that was run by shop floor workers, and they were selling articles that were defective items. And I can tell you, there were luxury brands featuring among those defective items hanging on the walls of this shop. You know, massive French luxury brands that everybody knows, but are produced in China, but in a rather anonymous fashion. They're off the radar. How is it that a customer who's paying a T-shirt 500 euros can bump into it in a Chinese high street shop? I mean, and it's not a false item, it hasn't been forged, but you pick it up for 50 euros, a tenth of its price. Comment off mic. Well, yes, there's the punching power of the brand, obviously, which is a factor that can't be neglected. But for militants, activists, people who want to change things, it's true that to reveal the mechanisms, the whirring wheels behind the fashion industry and this dream that is possibly a nightmare, also should prompt the brand to respond. An industry can absorb the shockwave that may be produced thereof, and brands are mindful of that. But I'm not going to name names, obviously. Mention has been made of duties, but we realise that it's the purchase. You know, it's the buyers that we have to speak to, and outreach for buyers is key, because these are people who get their materials from the same place or go to fairs such as this, and what they're going to be doing really is such that, you know, if we say to them the product, the final product, does it have it with the same value chain with this plant, this weaving factory? Are you able to know what's going on? And have you been there? Have you taken time to go in through the factory doors? That's crucial to be done at a hierarchical level that will make its decisions felt in the buying process. In a board of members, for example, they have CSR responsibilities, but that needs to trickle down. It needs to trickle down and need to be part of materials buyers' KPIs, because they're obviously constantly worrying about the margin. That's what you worry about at the end of the day. But it's also the cost price that you need to worry about, isn't it? Yes, but you know, best practices. We work with Galeries Lafayette on their Go for Good brand. We're a supplier for Go for Good in their home brand. But buyers have objectives, and a percentage of their collection needs to be bought from accredited suppliers. And that's good to see that, because it means that buyers are looking at both prices. They've got one which is Go for Food and the other one isn't. And they know that for the home brand, they're going to have to meet a certain percentage which meets certain thresholds, which is also good for the buyer. That's right. And you know, it's good for the buyer because the buyer is more interested in the job they're doing. We've all been buyers. We've all studied things deeply to know what we're talking about. I started in the luxury world because I liked the product. I worked with Vuitton and Hermes and for Chanel, and I knew that I was working for fabulous products, but I was frustrated to know that the final product, a final customer who was buying a dress for 30,000 euros, and in the dress, massive savoir-faire, but had no idea about the embroidery skills, the amazing lace work that was being done by very skilled people. It's very frustrating. Yes, obviously the luxury dimension for fashion needs to be looked at. What about the rest of you? Well, no, there's lots of family-run companies that are not under pressure from a stock market price. They have autonomy, and maybe they have to pick up on customers and militants' demands. So possibly only not these family-run firms may be off the radar a little bit. Yes, it's true. When we say industry, it's all encompassing, isn't it? It's a bit of a blanket term, but doesn't encompass everybody. I mean, you can't compare apples and oranges. You can't compare a family-run company with a massive corporation. And in Fairly Made, we understand this virtuous attitude. It's a nice word, virtuous, isn't it? But this virtuous attitude is a bit. It really depends on the manufacturing or production phase that you're dealing with. How upstream or downstream you are. You know, maybe by breaking up the value chain like that, we're making progress in some areas and not in others. Well, there's a discussion that's quite interesting to follow, in fact. What type of thing can you do to drive CSR forward? In France, you're going to hear a lot about the regulatory approach. When I talk with my American colleagues about this, they're struck, they're surprised. In the United States, the G7 covenant, no doubt you've heard about that, by the 150 big French brands or international brands, I can't quite remember. But anyway, the American praxis for Americans is possibly something that cannot be understood. Yeah, there's CFDA, for example, for well-being of models, and that's an important point. That links in with workers, about a worker, isn't it? Yes, exploitation of people, basically. Whereas the French, their stance has been more top-down, if I can put it that way. In the United States, FDR asked people to structure their approach. Maybe it's just a cultural perspective. What work in France won't in the US, and vice versa. Anyway, that's the subject for discussion. Perhaps our American colleague can provide input. I don't know.
I mean, on the U.S. side, again, I hate to be the one speaking for the entire United States, but...
That's fantastic. That's a role, madame.
From what I've seen from the larger brands that are thinking about sustainability now, and the larger retailers like for Walmart, for example, they're not so much thinking about it from the products that they're buying, but their first mantra is going to be starting with packaging, right? So they're sort of, let's avoid the rest of the supply chain of the products we actually buy, and we'll just focus on packaging as sort of a band-aid to then thinking about everything else. But I think for smaller brands, they just, at least in the US, and for brands that want to do smaller runs, there's not a lot they can do without the scale that like an H&M or a Walmart or anyone has. So, and they, it's a bit harder to get over to Europe or to Asia or anywhere to source quality fabrics that are more sustainable. So that we're sort of stuck with distributors that we have onshore and that can do things quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This picture is yours. Cette image est vous.
Yes, yes.
Can you comment it? Vous pourriez le commenter
So,
parce que
I
what if
realized
brands could have quick return, no minimum
Sure.
transparent
So,
production management in their
yeah.
hands?
So I realized I should have maybe given a slightly longer description of what we do. So we're a production management software that has sort of streamlined the process of getting products made. So we allow brands of all sizes to digitize their tech packs, get bids from no minimum micro manufacturers that are US based right now, and then have products made in about 6 weeks for the end customer. So right now what we do is we, like I mentioned, we're enabled. So we basically, by capturing all this data at the design level and then into the supply chain, we can allow brands to pre-sell garments. So there's no inventory, there's no cash flow invested in the inventory, there's no inventory waste in dead stock, and then sell them direct to consumer and have them made exactly for them in sort of a traditional way and delivered straight to their door. So it's sort of by taking a step back and rethinking the way that the retail model works, we're sort of de facto more sustainable because we're not making thousands of units that we don't know that will sell. We're allowing brands to sort of democratize the access to the market, put products up that maybe a niche market will like, and then sell and make exactly what sells.
Thank you so much. Merci
Yeah,
beaucoup.
of course.
que je trouve intéressant, c'est dans ce que vous dites, mesdames et messieurs, sur le thème.
So what I find interesting in terms of this afternoon's theme, and I think we've defined this quite well, this idea of the social impact, the different players involved, the different degrees of commitment, capacity, in order to meet one's obligations. So how do we innovate in this particular field? What changed the situation? It's the social networks, the consumer that expressed their various needs and desires. So, but in terms of innovation, we've been asked to talk about innovation. So what will allow us to innovate more, and what will allow us to move further towards this objective of positive social impact? Well, the consumer is waiting for new things to emerge. Are you talking about the social media, the ability to react? Well, people who deal in eco-responsible fashion, they take the time to this. So we have to understand this. The situation is so complex that we have to think about what second-hand fashion is. And often people become eco-responsible by buying second-hand clothes, or there are other factors involved, having a better job, more time for oneself, to be a responsible consumer, consume food responsibly. So we often come back to the food sector, especially when we talk about distribution. Food distribution, it's often this attitude and the behavior, the way we eat, what we consume, what we swallow, what we put on our skins, as well. So why are things so simple in food? You buy a food product, you cook it, you eat it, and so you can tell immediately if it's a good product or not. But with a fashion garment, you have to wear it, you have to wash it, you have to maintain it, wear it again. And so the process takes several months before you know whether you bought something of quality or not, whether you know that it's nice to wear, and whether you want to continue to maintain that garment. So it's not something that is immediately obvious. It's something that you have to discover over time. No, the parallel that we've drawn with food, and Eloise, before we launched Slow We Are, Eloise worked for some time in the food sector, 2007 to 2008, and just 15% of consumers knew the organic food label. And it took about 10 years for this to take off. So we're talking about half a generation then. In 10 years' time, we've doubled the production, the amounts produced. We've divided by 2 the budget, which is dedicated to fashion. So then you have to multiply that by 4 or by 6. So this is what's quite shocking. So once we've worked on the quality of the garment, the working conditions, there's not an awful lot left to improve margins. So the only thing we can do is to inject extra value in the work and in the materials. So we're talking about going back to inventing the wheel. So when I was in primary school, we invented the wheel 10,000 years ago, and this was to transport things. But this goes back much further than that. So the textile sector then has always been a rich source of innovation, but we've lost a lot of the expertise and competences because the increase in globalization in the 80s led to more automation, etc. Okay, that can be quite virtuous in some respects because it freed up men and women to do other things. So you just need to think of a spinning factory. The noise in there is absolutely horrendous. So automation can be a good thing. Well, machines always make a noise. But men don't always work on machines. So now in terms of these factories. So tell us a bit more about the worker. So we've understood the principles behind this. Do you work for a lot of brands today? Well, we brought out our own collections. When did you create this? 2 years ago. We created, so we produced a collection in Saint-Denis, and we also created one for the Biennale in Venice. We also, this was in the women's prison in Venice. And the last project that's currently ongoing is a partnership with maintenance staff for La Redoute. So La Redoute has decided to give this the capsule collection to their maintenance workers, and so it's the maintenance workers that have designed work clothes. We haven't got any slides of that. Well, we did see a picture before of your collection, I believe. I got the impression that we did see something that you produced. So this slide, this is Fadila. She's a worker. She works in Saint-Denis, and so this is what she created herself. This is her own model. So the objective behind About a Worker, the idea is that an item of clothing is not just aesthetic. It needs to communicate a message. So like a bag that you have or something. So it says, fashion is my refuge. But basically we create these and initiate these movements. Here we are. So no, it's the one after that. So we create these principles. So it's a traditional way of creating a garment. We go through 4 different steps, and this allows the worker to be able to express themselves, but also to show their vision of industries and the vision of the company. So we're not going to ask them to put photos on Pinterest or elsewhere, but we'll ask them to take their own photos of their factory, something that represents where they work. Take a few photos of their home as well, and look for the right materials, and they'll be able to express their own story, and like in Venice, they express their own story, their own life. We really worked on their identities, especially for the Venice project, and then we will ask them to create prototypes. To deconstruct, to construct worker clothes using the traditional blue. This was what we used for the Saint-Denis collection, and for the collection in Venice. So in one day, they will try and really express themselves through these different steps. So it's a bit like an exercise, if you like, and at the end of the day, they will come up with a final garment. And this will allow them to express what their vision is of industry, and it adds value to them and their role within the company. Well, everything depends on the factory. Each time we work with a partner, what's very important for us is to look at the context. For example, so that will be very good for our professor here. Well, you can't. There are some projects which are carried out abroad, but we can't just go to the factory without knowing the context and say, okay, well, we're going to educate you here. That's kind of smacks of colonialism. I think that fashion, for a long time, we could say, was very colonialist. But anyway, that's another debate. So it's important for us to study the context, and for the prisoners, the women prisoners in Venice. So we couldn't photograph them like we did for the Saint-Denis collection. So we basically looked at their identity outside the prison. So this was a kind of therapeutic experience for them, and it's a way for them to rediscover their own values. We asked them to create masks, not to hide themselves, but to really show their true identity. And then they also use the same ideas in the collection for Burano. So this is a bit like the Avignon Festival, where they work with prisoners, for example. So our sociology professor. Oh, you're scaring me. In terms of what you've heard, what about what conclusions can you draw from what's been said? Well, there are many things that have been said. The point of studying the context, this idea of colonialization, this idea that styles, can be simplified. So it's very interesting looking at the work that you do. I didn't actually know about this, so it's something new that I've discovered, and that's the point of these roundtables, after all. So putting together the economic factors, the cultural factors, fashion and industry, with a very concrete dimension, the materials. So I've learned lots of things. Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody in the audience have a question for our speakers? Serge, can you say who you are first? Introduce yourselves. Serge Crutel. I'm a professor in ENSA, and also I'm an advisor for companies, basically French companies, but some international ones as well. So I'd like to react to what has been said. Of course, it's quite true, and we talked about it this morning. We talked about the men and women in the textile sector in general, but also we have to go back to our own history. If we look at Roubaix at the beginning of the 20th century, is very much like things we can see elsewhere. So there's so in terms of the textile sector, textile companies, well, they've become very important because of the masses that they produce. People tend to work in very bad conditions. So there's a kind of continuity there in terms of human history as well. And also there are people who want to move in the other direction. And there's a small structure that we have in Calais, and this is a packaging factory. This is for women who've been beaten or mistreated, have a very hard time in life, and so this is we try to put them back into a different context so that they can create something new, a new product, so a dress, a skirt, or something like that. So we try to give a meaning to the product, and through that give them a meaning for their lives. So I think that is very important, because we live in a society where we consume all these products. We don't even know how they're made. We put it away in a cupboard somewhere, and then we end up throwing it away. So there's a whole process involved. So you talked about the materials and all that. So every day I am more surprised by the ignorance of people when it comes to the materials. There's a lot of confusion. Even the other day I saw industrialists talking about linen and hemp, which are quite different, and they're not made in the same way or produced in the same way. So it just goes to show that there's not a lot of knowledge in terms of the science of materials, and I think that that is very important. So giving a life to products and creating knowledge about materials, and not just referring to polyester, cotton polyester. So we have to do something in that respect, provide information on materials. So I work at a particular school, and there we really do focus on materials. We look at what they can produce, what the functions are of the materials, but everything has to be done still in terms of materials. So I think around this table, and just like the round table this morning, we have people that want to change the situation, and that is very necessary at the moment. So we also have to engage the change. Any other questions? Any other comments? Ladies, gentlemen, no more questions? We have some more round tables. There's one in a quarter of an hour's time. Talking about technology once again, blockchain. So there are quite a lot of you today. First of all, I'd like to thank our speakers and thank you for your contributions and the food for thought and the different actions that you are taking now.
Vous avez dit les uns et les autres.
So thank you to everybody. Every day and tonight at 6 o'clock there is a networking session here for you, the visitors and the exhibitors. Take an invitation if you want at the Fashion Tech stand. And I was very lucky to meet you. Thank you again and well done. You can continue to discuss amongst yourselves. Thank you.
Si.